As you learned in the previous episode, when it comes to staying pain-free, prevention is better than any cure. And in your pursuit of staying pain-free, nothing's worse than wanting to look after your body, but just not having the time or energy or even resources to do so. Now, the problem is that a lack of physical activity opens the doors for numerous types of physical injuries and dysfunctions throughout the body. Knees can start aching, lower backs can become sore, shoulders can feel like a hot bag of garbage, and so on. But there's an easy strategy to go after here to help get you to start moving your body more. And you're in luck because on this episode of the Strength Resurgence podcast, I'm breaking down this strategy in detail. We're talking common mistakes, building behavioral momentum, and making some seriously good stuff happen for your body. So let's break it down and get after it. All right, welcome back to the Strength Resurgence podcast. This is episode number 2, where we're going to be talking about what we call micro-stimulations or intermittent workouts. All sorts of different names around the concept that we're going to be going through here today. But the whole reason for this is to help solve some problems when it comes to not finding, enough time and energy to be physically active, which we know is going to predispose individuals to all sorts of aches and pains and injuries. So we're going to be talking about this kind of micro-stimulation strategy to help get around some of these issues. So as we go along here and get rocking and rolling, just want to say thank you very much for being here. Real quick, if you don't know who I am, my name is Jim. I am a physical therapist and a strength and conditioning specialist, which just means I have a designation towards kind of having some extra understanding of exercise and how it can help individuals become stronger, get out of pain, all that type of stuff, which really just means I'm pretty geeky about what it is I do when it comes to helping others move better and get out of pain, and even preventing a lot of that from happening in the first place. Now, additionally, just real quick, I want to say thank you for tuning into this podcast because there's about 3 million podcasts out there from what Mr. Google has informed me of anyways. And it's really not lost on me that you're taking some time to spend with me here. So I really appreciate that. I'm going to try and give you some great information to make it worth your while. And since you're going to be spending some time with me here, listening to some concepts and strategies that we're going over, I figured I might as well just give you a fun little fact about me. So we can make this a little bit more personal, perhaps, and just make this feel like you're just listening to someone who's just like you in some regard, who has all sorts of, kind of unique interests and things in life and all that. And so in that regard, just a fun little fact about me as we get going along here is, while I am a physical therapist and I love being one for sure, if I couldn't do that as a career, I think I'd definitely kind of gravitate towards becoming a psychologist, because I do think that human psychology is pretty fascinating and ties into all sorts of different aspects and avenues of our lives, not just with psychology in the profession itself, but just day-to-day interactions. So anyways, I think psychology is pretty cool stuff, and certainly gravitate towards doing that if I couldn't do all the other stuff that I love to geek about instead, with helping people move better and feel better and all of that fun stuff. So in that regard, what are we talking about in this episode exactly here? Well, let's just kind of give you a quick run through of what we're going through here. We're really going to open up by talking about the link between a lack of physical activity or physically active lifestyle and pain that can creep into our lives when we don't have enough physical activity going on. We're also going to be talking about the most common issues that tend to hold us back from pursuing that routinely physically active lifestyle filled with lots of good movement and exercise and all these other good physical tasks that we could be doing to help our body out. And then naturally, that's going to lead us into a short conversation on, faulty thinking towards what it takes to be physically active, especially on a regular basis. And then we're really going to start talking about, because of those faulty thinking habits, how we can go about changing our thoughts and our behaviors with all of this. And that's going to be some pretty important stuff, because I think that's where a lot of this ultimately starts with, is kind of how do we reframe a lot of these issues that we're up against. And that is basically going to lead us perfectly into the whole concept of what we call micro-stimulations or intermittent workouts. Pretty great strategy for just helping us overcome some of these issues that so many people tend to have with wanting to remain physically active, but seem to have a hard time doing so. And then that's going to lead us into a fun little conversation with something that we call trigger exercises or trigger workouts. It's just a great little strategy we can use to help keep ourselves moving more in certain ways. And then really we're going to tie that all together into practical applications. So ways that we can make sure we're not just kind of taking the concepts and not executing on them, but taking the concepts and applying them into our own individual lives. So going to be some really cool things that we're going to talk about with that. And first, as we get going into this, I just thought it'd be good to open up with a quick little quote to mentally chew on, one that, again, can just kind of help get us in the mindset of thinking about how we're going to frame this upcoming discussion here on moving a bit more. And so that quote is just the one that says, "The first wealth is health." Now, I don't know who came up with that quote, but it's one I've always liked because for me, it just helps to mentally frame up, the importance of that physically active lifestyle, one that can help avoid all these painful conditions we can sometimes really find ourselves up against when we're not looking after ourselves in the best physical manner possible. I guess to me, I think if I don't really have my physical well-being, then what do I really have? But I also do frame that up with mental health, right? We talk about, like in the last episode, how we really have about 5 domains of health and wellness, 6 if you count what we call a financial domain, but the 5 standard domains of health and wellness: physical health, but also social health, emotional health, intellectual health, and spiritual health. And really thinking about, if we have health in all those domains, then I think in some capacity we're pretty wealthy. I think for me personally, having all the money in the world, but lacking quite noticeably in any one of those aforementioned domains there, I'm probably not all that wealthy. But nonetheless, think about that quote as we get going here. Kind of mentally chew on that as you wish. Let it kind of percolate through your brain. And we're going to now move into the problem that we're going to try and solve here in this episode, which is really that kind of that low activity lifestyle that just kind of gets the body into a little bit of a rough shape, so to speak, and how we're going to overcome that. And so we're going to start out with just a little bit of factual information here. So according to the National Institute of Health, or National Institute for Health, often abbreviated as the NIH, we have about 31% of the global population that is currently sedentary. Now, sedentary is just a word that talks about a lack of physical exertion or physical activity or exercise. So we are going to get into just a formal definition of that word in a moment, just so, one, we're all kind of on the same page, but realistically, just we're talking about a lack of physical exertion in our lives. And so, in that regard, it's important to kind of talk about what a sedentary lifestyle can lead to. And really, it can lead to a lack of health and a whole lot of complications, including a risk of injury, pains, and various dysfunctions from a physical perspective within the body. And we're really only talking about the physical here. A lack of physical exercise can, alter our mood and all that as well. But we're just really going to look at this from a physical perspective for the time being. So again, why are we trying to solve this whole problem here? And when you think about it, the problem here is that routinely performing physical activity and exercise can be challenging for many reasons. When you look at kind of the most common reasons why individuals might not be physically active on a regular basis, there can be a whole bunch of reasons, but realistically, we're going to kind of get into 2 to 3 particular common reasons. And so that first one is just simply because there's a lack of time in the day. Many individuals report just not having enough time, which is especially true when you are someone who you work full time, you have a family to look after as well, you have obligations with paying bills and doing groceries and errands and all these other things. The lack of time is certainly a real factor for sure. That's arguably the most common one. The second most common one for most people not being routinely physically active enough is a lack of energy. And this is one that I can certainly empathize with, and the first one too for that matter. But you work hard all day long and you have all these other obligations to do, which are pretty important obligations most of the time. That just kind of leaves a little gas in the tank for actually going to the gym or committing to an hour-long workout or a 30-minute workout or 45-minute workout, especially when we're working out at higher intensities. You really have, at that point where you get home by the end of the day, perhaps after a long day of work, even just the thought of moving around a bit more can kind of be overwhelming. And then there's also the condition of lack of resources. A lot of people say, hey, I have the willingness to get stronger and get enough strength in my body to eliminate these aches and pains and conditions I might otherwise be up against, but don't have the money for a gym membership or for fitness equipment at home or whatever it's going to be. So 3 very common issues that people run up against. But we really want to ask ourselves here, what if there were strategies to overcome some of these issues? And there's plenty of strategies for that matter, but today we're really breaking it down from this kind of intermittent workout or micro-stimulation strategy that we're going to get into here. But let's quickly start off again with that definition for that word I mentioned a moment ago, the word sedentary. So the word sedentary here, the easy way to think about it is just that it means that there's a lack of physical exercise or exertional physical movement in our daily lifestyle. And so really just think about it as behavior referring to a state in which minimal levels of energy are being used by the body. That's essentially what we're talking about here. I will give you a formal definition here. It's going to sound very wordy, but don't get too hung up on that. I'm including the definition, 1, so we can kind of make sure we're on the same page. But 2, in case you do want to learn a little bit more about this is going to be a definition that might want to help you out with that. And the definition is really just showing that there's a way that we can determine how much energy a person is expending, regardless of their age, or their gender or anything of that sort. We can compare apples to oranges, if you will, in that regard, just from one person's body to another. So when we ultimately look at the definition here, we're just going to think of a sedentary lifestyle or sedentary behavior, or being sedentary as any waking behavior, such as sitting or leaning, with an energy expenditure of what we would call 1.5 metabolic equivalent of task or less. Now, metabolic equivalent of task, or MET, what does that mean? Well, this is where I'm going to break it down real quick, but don't get too hung up on this definition. It will sound wordy. All it means is that we can determine how much energy is expending, a person is expending, by how much oxygen their body is taking in and utilizing relative to their body mass. Ultimately, that's what this means. If we look at the very wordy definition, the metabolic equivalent of task, or MET, it's the objective measure of the ratio of the rate at which a person expends energy relative to the mass of that person while performing some specific physical activity compared to a reference, which that reference is currently set by convention at an absolute of 3.5 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram per minute, which is the energy expended when sitting quietly by a reference individual. So again, told you, pretty wordy concept or definition. But all we're talking about here is how much energy a person is taking in and utilizing per kilogram of body weight per minute. And we use that by kind of measuring oxygen consumption. And then we've set kind of 3.5 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram per minute as what we would call a sedentary lifestyle in terms of the metabolic equivalent of task. But I'm kind of getting down into the weeds with this, so I apologize if I've lost you a bit on that. So let's talk about some of these sedentary issues real quick and why we want to be a bit more physically active whenever we can. So ultimately, what we're wanting to be aware of here is that when we're sedentary, our body kind of gets what we call deconditioned, out of shape, if you will, or it's unable to tolerate higher levels of activity and force and stress. And the more deconditioned the body becomes, the more susceptible it is to injury. And all sorts of injuries can arise when our body can't meet the demands of some of the daily tasks that it needs to go through. We can have lots of different things go on, and this is a lot of the stuff that I deal with when I work with individuals in the clinic or train individuals in the gym, for that matter. We can get conditions such as what we call arthropathies, which fancy way of saying joint conditions and things going wrong with our joints. So you think about things like knee osteoarthritis, where the cartilage is breaking down in the knee, it's becoming painful, doesn't move all that smoothly. We can get what's called facet arthropathy, where there's things going wrong in the facet joints, which are these joints in our spine They can break down, become irritated, all these other icky, painful things. We can also, if we're deconditioned, and this is a very common one, get conditions that we call tendinopathies, which just, again, means that there's something pathological or wrong with the tendons. Tendons are what anchor a muscle onto a bone, which allows to basically produce movement. And these tendons can get sore and gunky and broken down, and you can get conditions like what we call Achilles tendinosis, or a generalized kind of gunky breakdown of our Achilles tendon, for example. You'll often hear it called Achilles tendinitis, an inflammatory process, typically from a tendon being overused acutely or in kind of a short-term sense, which becomes really painful when you step and walk. You can get things like what we call trochanteric pain. So the trochanter is that knobby projection on the outside of your upper thigh bone there. A lot of muscles and tendons attach right in through there. And those tendons, glute medius, glute minimus, can get deconditioned and become incredibly painful when you stand and walk. And it's a really nasty condition. I deal with it a lot in the clinic, and it's not a fun thing to have. We can get conditions we call sarcopenia, which just refers to a loss of muscle mass. That in and of itself leads to all sorts of issues arising, where we can have a higher likelihood of muscle strains, so muscles being exerted with too much force, where they can't meet that force and become sore and painful. Get conditions that we call like a full thickness tear, where a muscle tears right in half, or a partial tear, where you have part of the muscle or tendon kind of just getting chewed up a little bit. Not a fun situation to go through. And then we have really nasty ones like what we call osteopenia and osteoporosis, which just means that there's a demineralization or kind of weakening of our bones. Really, really nasty one, because then we're more prone to bones breaking for all sorts of reasons, which is not a good condition at all. So falling down and breaking a hip, that's kind of the common one most people think of, with kind of more brittle bones for osteoporosis. But people can get what we call compression fractures, where the vertebrae themselves are breaking down just from a lack of mineralization or health within the bones. We can even get conditions that we call neuropathies, where this is basically meaning that things are going wrong with the nerves in our bodies. You can get conditions we call peripheral neuropathy, just meaning that the nerves on the kind of outside, the extremities, hands, toes, all that, those nerves get icky and you get nasty pain with that. Carpal tunnel syndrome can be the result of deconditioning within the body as well. So needless to say, this whole sedentary lifestyle issue really predisposes us to a lot of things that can go wrong. And as you learned about in that previous episode, if you did take the time to tune into that one, prevention's better than any cure. And that's kind of our first initial strategy in all of this, is finding ways to prevent these things from happening in the first place. So we're talking about finding ways to become more physically active. So the next question then becomes, well, how much activity are we really talking about here to ensuring that we're helping our body out to the best extent possible? And so in that regard, we would probably go by kind of what the Center of Disease Control, or the CDC, recommends, which is to achieve about 150 minutes of moderate physical activity per week. Now, we'll have to talk about what moderate means in that regard. But nonetheless, I don't want anyone thinking that it means you have to be slaving away as hard as you can for 150 minutes a week. That's not really what we're getting at here. And we'll break that down a little bit more in a minute. But really, if we're getting 150 minutes a week, traditionally we might want to think about doing 30 minutes of movement exercise at a moderate intensity for 5 days out of the week. And that'd be about 150 minutes or so. A little over 2 hours that we're collectively talking about within a single week. And again, when we talk about the intensity, we're really talking about moderate intensity being enough to elevate the heart rate and breathing, so that we are sweating a little bit. We'll talk in a moment in something that we call about the talk test. The talk test is a great way to kind of just make sure that you can easily reference whether you're kind of in a zone of intensity that's appropriate for ensuring you're getting some better health, ultimately going better results from this physical activity you might find yourself doing. So the other thing that we do want to be aware of is that in addition to the exercise where we're moving and elevating our heart rate, breaking a light sweat, we want to think about strengthening our muscles as well. So we're thinking aerobic activity for the heart and lungs and that, but muscle strengthening for the bones and joints in that regard, which we should probably be doing about twice a week, typically by focusing on large muscle groups of the body. Because again, we know that we kind of need that balance. We need endurance and aerobic activity to improve one aspect of our health, but actual physical strengthening of our muscles and tendons and joints to make sure that we're ultimately getting everything that we can out of the activities that we're doing to prevent aches and pains and issues from arising in the first place. But talk about all that, 115 minutes a week. Well, pretty easy to come up, with the initial thought of, I don't have the time or the energy to make all that happen. And don't worry, we're going to get into this whole micro-stimulation intermittent workout concept to really make sure that we have ways to modify our thinking around all of this. So we'll get to that in just a moment. Now, real quick, when we talk about exercise intensity and needing moderate intensity, the easy way to think about this here is, we can get kind of complicated with this, and we can talk about dividing aerobic activity or just physical exercise into different zones of intensity, typically through 5 different zones. Zone 1 being the lowest, and then zone 2 being the second lowest, and zone 3, 4, and zone 5 being the highest. And we would base those zones based off of a percentage of our heart rate and maximal heart rate, and then a percentage of that maximal heart rate. And so we won't get into the details of it, but there is a method that you can use to determine if you're actually in the right zone with these percentages. It's called the Karvonen method, Karvonen, I think, for spelling. You can look that up if you want to learn how to do the exact percentages of these zones for your heart rate. But ultimately, we're going to think about trying to achieve exercise intensity in around kind of a zone 2 or maybe a zone 3. Zone 2 being about 60 to 70% of our maximal heart rate. Zone 3 being 70 to 80. But probably that zone 2 is going to be good for most people, at least for a starting point. So when we divide all of this exercise intensity into these 5 zones, you can get really scientific with it, but an easy way, especially if you're first starting out, is to just simply use what we would call the talk test, where we want to just try and kind of gauge our exercise intensity, where you can perhaps hold down a conversation if you had to by going through your workout, but not being able to just talk continuously, kind of like what I'm doing right now. So you want to be exercising or moving at an intensity where as you're doing that, you're having to stop and quickly say things in different fragments of sentences to make sure that you can still breathe. You get the idea, right? So somewhere in that intensity, if you're exercising at an intensity lower where you can keep talking, probably not going to get as much physical benefit as we'd like, but somewhere in that talk test zone of making sure we can't quite talk normally, but you're not working so hard you're completely unable to talk, that's simply a good starting point for kind of getting yourself into the right zone. And you can look at these zones and kind of rough equivalents of what we would call that that metabolic equivalent of task. Typically, if we know that sedentary behavior is kind of around that, that kind of lower end of things, going up into maybe a zone 2 would just mean that we're approximately around 5 metabolic equivalent of tasks, just meaning that our body needs to be using more oxygen in order to make sure we can sustain that activity. Probably a good zone to be in for most people, a zone 2 to zone 3 of 5 METs to 8 METs. But again, I'm trying to steer clear of too much higher level discussion here of all the geeky stuff and just focusing on the basic concepts. So in order to make all this happen, if we have a lack of time and energy and even resources for that matter, we need to shift our way of thinking of going, well, how do I do all this when I don't have any of those components, time, energy, resources, or all 3 of them for that matter? And really, if you've ever heard that old phrase, it's a good one to think about here. What's the best way to eat an elephant? And the answer, right, is one bite at a time, which is just a funny way of thinking that we need to kind of break things down, right? We need to not look at the large task in front of us, but how do we break it down bit by bit to make things feel more manageable? So there's another quote that I really like that's going to help tie into the mindset of all this here as we go along, which is that yard by yard, things are hard, but inch by inch, anything's a cinch. I don't know who came up with that quote, but I've always really liked it because this is all about mindset. How do we look at things in a way where we can frame it so it's not quite as overwhelming? A lot of behavior involved with this, which ties into mindset, right? So changing our mindset, especially with something we might find ourselves up against, it can result in behavioral changes that really do set us up for success. I think there's some profound benefits to looking at things with the right mindset. So if we're going to be talking about breaking down the elephant here, I think what we need to do is we need to first start breaking down what we would call all or nothing thinking. So all or nothing thinking just meaning, look, if I don't have the time to do a 30-minute workout, man, there's just no point, right? I either do the whole thing or I don't. There's no point in doing anything in between. So all or none thinking, common issue that I myself have struggled with for a number of years, because I either want to do all of it or I feel like it's not worth doing it all. And it can kind of be a trap, right? And we got to find ways around that. So if we can offset our all or nothing thinking, we can really generate some serious momentum with the progress that we make of living a healthier lifestyle, being more routinely physically active, and therefore keeping our body strong and conditioned and avoiding a lot of natural injuries and painful conditions that can arise when we are deconditioned. So, if you can schedule time for regular workouts and physical activity, then do it. That's definitely the best way to go about this. If you can routinely block off 30 minutes, 45 minutes, 60 minutes, whatever it's going to be for 3, 4, 5, 6 days a week, I think really that's probably the best place to be. But it's not the most feasible way to look at things for a lot of people based on conditions of our lifestyle with what we might be up against. But if you can do that, that's a great strategy, right? Just block off that time. You say, this is my time. It's reserved for being physically active. So, no phone calls, no meetings or whatever it's going to be. But that doesn't work for everyone. So we're going to have to just acknowledge that life happens. And it can be discouraging when you're trying to plan and block off times for physical activities and looking after yourself and things still keep popping up. It's very overwhelming and frustrating. If you're finding that you're trying to make your best efforts with this, but life keeps getting in the way, it's pretty hard to stay physically active. So in that regard, we're going to think about going back to breaking down the elephant bite by bite. So, what if we took a single 30-minute workout that we were, going to intend to do, but we knew we were going to have a really busy day. And so instead of just blocking off a 30-minute block throughout the day, we broke it up into multiple 5-minute segments throughout the day. This can be a powerful strategy where we're really getting into this whole intermittent workout concept or micro-stimulation. But as we do, I do want to say that as we kind of get into this concept of these micro workouts, micro-stimulations, intermittent workouts, whatever we're going to call them, we're not necessarily saying that they're going to achieve the exact same thing as a full-on dedicated 30-minute workout. But what we are saying is that one, it's absolutely better than nothing. And two, we're going to say that a lot of this is just helping us reframe our behavior around finding ways to stay moving. So when we talk about micro-stimulations or intermittent workouts, they really are great for changing how we perceive the task of staying physically active. Very, very powerful strategy here. So again, we're trying to change our behavior of how we view the task of staying physically active and providing that sense of control, right? No matter how busy life gets, no matter how chaotic the day gets, always knowing that we have a way that we can get a little bit more movement and activity into our day. And it's a tactic that we can use essentially to fight back against that overwhelming feeling of life demanding so much of us where we have a lack of time, we have a lack of energy. Very powerful tactic for making sure that we're not feeling kind of hopeless and kind of dead in the water, so to speak. So I like to call it behavioral momentum. That's really what we're creating here. And we're therefore breaking down all these barriers when it comes to things that prevent us from staying active and living that healthy lifestyle that we want. So perhaps maybe what we should do here is kind of give a couple of examples of what I'm talking about here. So, we know that maybe we're going to have this really busy day, and man, getting up at 5 a.m. and you go, yeah, this is going to be tough to find a way to carve out a 30, 45-minute block of physical activity today. So, in that regard, if we know it's going to be a tough day to get through with that, what if we then just come up with the thought of, hey, I'm just going to aim for a total of 100 body weight squats that I have to do by the end of the day. Whether I do 10 before I head out the door off to work, or on lunch break, I do 50, I come home, I do another 10 or 20, or it could be 200 body weight squats a day, whatever you feel is appropriate for your body, right? But hopefully you can see this is how we can start framing up getting more physical activity done on a regular basis throughout the day while fighting that issue of time or energy or whatever it's going to be. So we could also maybe use an example of thinking about 10 lunges per leg every hour when we're at home in the evening. So if you're at home for 3 or 4 hours in the evening, but you have to do housework, you have to do all these other things around the house, well, maybe just having that goal of doing 10 lunges per leg every hour, a great way to get a little bit more movement and activity into the body. Another one is we could talk about just seeing if you could achieve 10,000 steps by the end of the day, or maybe 8,000 steps or 6,000 steps. That's getting pretty easy to track these days with, the fitness apps and, smartphones and all these things. I have a little step counter on my watch actually, and so I try and get about 10,000 a day. It doesn't always happen, but most of the times it does. And it's a great way just to say, hey, by the end of the day, I'm going to see if I can get that 10,000 steps in. So maybe that by lunch you go, I'm going to go get 1,000 steps in at lunch real quick as I eat some food and walk around for a little bit. Great strategy there. But there's all these different ways that you can personalize this for yourself. So think about what would work well for you in your personal situation and lifestyle, because there's no shortage of ways that we could go about thinking this. So again, what does it all do? Well, it's really building a consistent behavior towards achieving physical movement. That's ultimately what we're doing here, is we're finding ways to foster the mindset of staying moving and not feeling overwhelmed by all this kind of lack of time and energy and all of that. Now, this leads us kind of into another strategy that we can use here. This is a fun one. This is what we call trigger workouts. So trigger workouts are basically, we also call them trigger exercises, but a trigger exercise, it just involves performing a movement or an exercise every time a specific event occurs throughout the day. So I will give you lots of examples here, and I've been using this one a lot over the last year or two, and it's a lot of fun. So if there's a specific event that happens throughout the day that you know is going to happen a few times a day here or there, it can be a great way to basically build a higher volume of movement and exercise throughout each day. And we can do this at home or at work or anywhere else, depending on your circumstances and lifestyle. But here's a couple examples of what I'm talking about. Again, there's no rights or wrongs with any of this. But what if every time you're at home, before you go upstairs, upstairs to the bedroom, upstairs to the next level of your house, or down to the basement for that matter, you just say, okay, every time I head upstairs, downstairs, I just need to perform 10 body weight squats, right? You're using the stairs as a trigger for that exercise to occur. Or perhaps another one is, stretching while you're waiting for the microwave to finish. I use the microwave quite a bit, actually, for getting a bit more physical activity. If I'm warming something up for a minute or 30 seconds or whatever, I just tell myself, okay, I'm going to do body weight squats until the microwave goes off, or I'm going to do a stretch before the microwave goes off, just as a fun little way to kind of have that trigger to keep me moving a bit more. Or perhaps, again, every time right before you have a meal or a snack, you do 10 lunges. Anything of that sort could be just a fun way to kind of get some more movement or activity into your daily life. Again, there's no right or wrong strategies. You just need to find what's best for you here. So the one that I've used a couple times in the past is every time I check my email, whether it's on my computer or on my phone, I just do a little stretch or a simple movement right before, just for a handful of seconds. Again, just to foster that mindset of there's always little times throughout the day that I could be moving. Or perhaps, again, keeping a piece of fitness equipment by your desk or your couch, just for a bit more exercise versatility with this. It could be an exercise band, a small dumbbell, or a kettlebell. This is one where actually at my home here, I have a kettlebell that's right by the stairs. And I try and do 10 kettlebell swings right before I head up the stairs, just as a way to kind of, force myself to maintain that attitude of, hey, there's always something I could be doing to keep myself moving a tiny bit more. And again, not saying that it replaces a full workout by any means, but it's that behavior. It's that behavior of just saying, I'm going to find ways to be moving around a bit more. Or another one that I sometimes do, 10, incline push-ups. For some people, it could be incline push-ups from their hands or their knees, with your hands on the couch, I should say, and your knees on the floor. This would be good for upper body stimulation. Again, because we want to find ways maybe to stimulate the upper body as well. Or one that I do a lot too is I do stretching exercises during the commercial breaks of a TV show. So I get home from work and I'm exhausted, or it's not a day where I'm meant to be working out anyways. So maybe I'm watching the evening news, but I say, hey, when the news comes on, I'm just going to watch the news, but during commercial breaks, pop down on the floor, do a quick stretch my hip flexor, do a little mobility exercise for my upper back, anything like that. So you can have some fun ways to get creative with it. But at the end of the day, we're really tying this all back into the fact that finding ways to keep the body physically stimulated helps with pain. So there's a saying that we often use, we call it motion is lotion. Very common phrase you'll hear in the industry of physical therapy and health and wellness and all that. And it really is true. Movement helps the body in numerous ways. One example is that it can really help provide nutrition to the cartilage. The cartilage is kind of that shiny stuff, that shiny smooth surface on the end of a lot of our bones. Think about the bottom of your thigh bone where it connects to the top of your shin bone. Cartilage is what helps us kind of produce smooth, fluid movement. But that cartilage can break down if we don't get enough movement throughout our daily lives for days, weeks, months, years on end. Because again, something like that creates stimulation where we're helping to ultimately push fluid around the joint a bit more. We call it the synovial fluid. And that synovial fluid provides nutrition and substances for the cartilage itself to keep it healthy. We can think about, moving just in a sense where we create stimulation of muscles and tendons in our body. This works off of a mechanical principle called mechanotransduction. Fancy sounding word that just means we're taking physical input and converting it into cellular activity within the body to stimulate all sorts of healthy changes within the actual tissues that are being stimulated. Right? And then we can even talk about from pain reduction standpoints of movement helps to our body to release what we call like endorphins and things like what we call myokines, which are these molecules that can help cross the blood-brain barrier and help with our mood. Endorphins can kind of help eliminate some of that pain temporarily. Really, really good things that can happen with all of that. So again, those endorphins are the body's natural painkillers, and it's always nice to kind of use the body's natural painkillers rather than, exogenous ones or what we call, painkillers coming from medicine that we might ingest. So if we look at the key takeaways of all this, what are we really getting at here? So ultimately, the takeaways are that we're going to acknowledge that time and energy and resources, for that matter, are a universal struggle for so many people. That's some important stuff we do need to acknowledge. And so in that regard, you're not alone if you struggle to stay physically active and keep yourself moving either as much as you should or as much as you want, for that matter. That's something we need to acknowledge. And in that regard, we then need to acknowledge that all or nothing thinking regarding our physical workouts and activities creates a massive barrier to being able to be consistent with our activities. So something's better than nothing. If you can work out and move and do that kind of moderate intensity exercise once a week, sure, it's better than nothing. Twice a week is better than once. But the point is that there's times where maybe if we struggle with being consistent, then we just need to kind of break away from the all or nothing thinking. Again, in no way am I saying that these micro-stimulations and intermittent workouts give us the exact same physical cardiovascular benefits as continuous aerobic activity or exercise. We're not saying that. We're just saying that there's a mindset we can employ when we're feeling overwhelmed with the inability to find time and energy to keep ourselves moving. So intermittent workouts or micro-stimulations, they really help change our behavior towards this whole concept of finding ways to stay active and provide a sense of control for physical activities within our lives. So, in that regard, we're not saying that this is replacing, traditional workouts of that aerobic activity and a big strength training workout. Again, not saying that, but we're saying that it's important to be able to frame this in ways where we appreciate the fact that movement for the body is good one way or another, and that using this in a manner where we always have a strategy to move more, it will help, right? If nothing else, from that mindset perspective of that we're not totally, we're not totally overwhelmed and don't have any control over the situation. There's a lot of power in this mindset approach that we're looking at here. So, in that regard, you can plan your intermittent workouts, or you can use triggers, right? So some people, they plan and just say, okay, by the end of the day, I'm going to do, 4 or 5, 6 1-minute sessions, 2-minute sessions, 5-minute sessions of these movements or these exercises. That's great. That's awesome. Some people will use triggers, right? Where just, hey, every time I walk past the water fountain today at work, I'm going to do this quick little stretch, this quick little movement, or at home for that matter. Or you can do both of them, right? That's an important thing as well, too. We're not talking about hard and fast rules here. We're talking about ways in which you can feel that you gain a sense of control with all of this. So, use these techniques that we've talked about here to build that behavioral momentum around always finding ways to move, always feeling that you have some control over this busy, chaotic life and lifestyle that we all find ourselves in. So you will get physical benefits in the process too. That's the great point about all this. Now again, if you can schedule your workouts and just block off time and do your traditional workouts, awesome, really, really good. But now you've got a strategy just for on the days or times when you don't, because we all only have 24 hours in a day. So we got to use them wisely. It's not that some people have 26 hours or some people have 20, but at the same time, it's not a comparison either. Really just find what works for you here in this whole process. I think that's the big thing that we need to frame this all around. So that being said, if any of the concepts in this episode have helped you in any sort of way, please, it would just mean the world to me if you left a review, just so that, again, I can help spread the word about ways people can feel like they can reclaim some of their control around finding ways to move more and live a physically healthier, more active lifestyle, prevent aches and pains, reduce them, eliminate them. That would really mean the world to me. It's not about me. It's about helping others, and that's really what I'm trying to do here, I guess. That's what I'm trying to say. So also, if you feel anyone else could benefit from the contents of this episode, feel free to share it with them. In doing so, we could perhaps make the world a little bit less of a painful place for anyone who could or want to benefit from these strategies. That'd mean the world to me if that's something you do want to do. Now, nonetheless, I appreciate if you stuck all the way to the end here of the episode. In that regard, I'm still trying to figure out how this whole podcasting thing works. I'm not all that comfortable in front of cameras and behind microphones, but I love what I do too much just to keep it all to myself. And I feel that I've been blessed with a lot of opportunities in my life to have the experiences I've had and learn from the individuals whom I have. And my heart just wants nothing more to share this knowledge and experience and expertise with anyone who can benefit. So I hope you can find some benefit from what we've talked about in this episode. If anything I said has resonated with you, take it and run with it. Do what you will with it. If it doesn't work for you, just drop it and leave it by the wayside. Again, always advocate that you get evaluated by a medical professional and look after your own self by someone who can take the time to work with you individually. That is your most important plan of action you could ever do. But nonetheless, thanks so much for hanging out with me here. I hope that you continue to make great things happen, that you are making great things happen in this moment right now, and keep looking after yourselves and keep looking after one another. Keep making those great things happen, and I'll see you in the next episode.